In the spring of 1868, a stranger walked into a Kansas courtroom and confessed to a robbery he did not commit. He had arrived in the town of Millbrook only 3 days before. He knew no one there. He owed the sheriff nothing, the judge nothing, the town nothing, except for one man and one debt. She was the sister of the man who was actually guilty. She sat in the back row of that courtroom, 17 years old, and watched a stranger take her brother's crime as his own. She said nothing. Not that day. Not for 10 years. This is the story of Caleb Reyes, a drifter who paid for a robbery he never committed, and of Eleanor Hale, who spent a decade of her life trying to undo a lie that saved her family and nearly buried the man who saved it. It is a story about debt, the kind you can repay in a single act of courage and the kind that take a lifetime to settle. To understand why Caleb Reyes did what he did, you have to go back 2 years earlier to a stretch of flooded river country outside Abilene, Kansas. The Hale family were not wealthy, but they were proud, a small cattle operation built up by a father who had come west with nothing and meant to leave his children something. Thomas Hale, the only son, was 16. His sister Eleanor was 14. Their mother kept the household, their father kept the herd. In the spring of 1866, a late storm swelled the Smoky Hill River past its banks. The Hale family was crossing with a loaded wagon when the current caught the wheels and dragged them sideways. The wagon overturned. Thomas went into the water. His parents were on the bank, unable to swim. Eleanor was screaming from the shore, 14 years old, and certain she was about to watch her brother drown in front of her. A drifter was passing along the trail that day, a cattle hand between jobs, the kind of man town saw once and never again. His name was Caleb Reyes. He didn't know the Hale family. He didn't know their name, their history, or their debts. He went into that river without a second thought and pulled Thomas out by the collar of his shirt. Both of them nearly swept under twice before they reached the bank. He didn't stay to be thanked properly. Drifters rarely do. Within the week, Caleb Reyes had moved on, and the Hale family carried the memory of him the way you carry the memory of a stranger who once changed everything and then vanished. 2 years passed. In the winter of 1868, a broke and weathered Caleb Reyes rode into the town of Millbrook looking for work. It was Thomas Hale, 19 now, working his father's fading operation after his father's death, who recognized him first in the muddy street outside the feed store. Thomas didn't hesitate. He brought Caleb home, put him up in the barn, and gave him what work there was to give. What Thomas didn't say, what Caleb had no way of knowing, was how much had changed in the Hale household in 2 years. The father was gone, the debts were mounting, and Thomas, who had once been a frightened boy pulled from a river, had grown into a young man worn down by grief and shame, restless in a way that made him easy to lead astray. He had fallen in, quietly, with 2 men passing through the county, men who ran cattle they didn't own and carried cash they hadn't earned. Caleb Reyes arrived in Millbrook not knowing that the boy whose life he'd once saved was already standing at the edge of something he couldn't undo. On the night of the 9th of March, 1868, the Millbrook Trust was robbed of nearly $4,000 a fortune for a town that size, enough to ruin half the ranchers who banked there if the money was never recovered. A clerk working late was struck across the head and badly injured. 3 riders were seen fleeing north under cover of a moonless sky. By morning, the sheriff had gathered enough from frightened witnesses to name a suspect. The description matched Thomas Hale down to the scar along his jawline, a mark everyone in Millbrook would have recognized from a childhood accident. In the Hale farmhouse, panic set in fast. Thomas's mother, already worn thin by widowhood, understood immediately what a conviction would mean not just for her son, but for a family with no money left for lawyers and no standing left in town to soften a judge's opinion. Caleb Reyes had been in Millbrook 3 days. He had no alibi that mattered to anyone because nobody in town knew him well enough to vouch for where he'd been. He had no roots to protect, no family name to preserve, nothing to lose in the eyes of the law that Thomas Hale stood to lose tenfold. That night, in the barn where Caleb had been sleeping, Thomas broke down and confessed everything to 2 riders. The debt he owed them, the robbery gone wrong, the clerk he never meant to hurt. Caleb listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, there was a long silence between them. What Caleb said next would shape the next 10 years of both their lives. That a man who had pulled a boy from a river once did not get to stand by and watch that same boy drown a second time, even if the water this time was made of guilt and rope instead of current. By sunrise, Caleb Reyes had ridden into Millbrook alone and confessed to the robbery at the Millbrook Trust. He gave the sheriff a partial, false account of 2 other riders, men who by then had long since scattered and could not be found to contradict him. He never once spoke Thomas Hale's name. The trial that followed lasted less than 2 days. There was no lawyer in Millbrook willing to mount a serious defense for a drifter nobody could vouch for, and Caleb offered none himself. He simply confirmed again and again, under questioning from a skeptical judge, that he alone was responsible for what happened at the trust. Eleanor Hale sat in the gallery every day of that trial. She was 17 years old, and she understood with a clarity that would follow her for the next decade exactly what she was watching unfold in front of her. A man who owed her family nothing was being sentenced for a crime her brother had committed. She said nothing. Not when the sheriff read the charges. Not when the judge asked if the defendant had anything more to add in his own defense. Not even when Caleb, just once, glanced toward the gallery and found her eyes, a look she would spend years trying to interpret, torn between reading it as forgiveness and reading it as a plea to stay silent, to protect her brother the way he already had. The judge sentenced Caleb Reyes to 10 years of hard labor at the Kansas State Penitentiary. As the deputies led him from the courtroom in irons, he passed close enough to the gallery rail to speak without being overheard. He told her only to take care of her mother. Those were the last words he said to anyone in Millbrook before the doors closed behind him. The years that followed were quiet in the way that grief is quiet, not an absence of feeling, but a slow, grinding presence that never fully lifted. Thomas Hale could not stay in Millbrook. Within the year, unable to look his neighbors in the eye or sit across from his sister at supper without seeing Caleb's face, he left for work further west, sending money home when the seasons were kind and letters home less and less often as the years wore on. Eleanor's mother never fully recovered from the shame of what had happened, even though almost no one in town suspected the truth. It was a debt the family could never speak of, in a house that grew quieter every year and could never repay in any currency Eleanor could think of. Eleanor stayed. She ran what remained of the family's small operation, took in mending work to make ends meet, and carried the weight of the secret alone, because there was no one left in the house to carry it with her. In the second year after the trial, she began writing letters to Caleb at the penitentiary. She tore up the first 11 before finishing one she was willing to send. She was afraid, she would later admit, not of what he might say back to her, but of what it would cost her to finally say the truth out loud, even on paper, even to him. The letters she did send were careful, impersonal things at first. News of the harvest. Questions about whether he was allowed visitors, whether he had enough to eat, whether the winters inside those walls were as hard as the ones on the farm. She never once wrote the words, "I'm sorry," in those early years, though she meant them every time she picked up a pen. What finally moved her past caution wasn't guilt alone. She had been carrying guilt for years by then, and guilt alone had only ever produced more torn up letters. It was an accident. In the spring of 1873, 5 years into his sentence, a fire broke out in the workshop wing of the penitentiary. Caleb was among the men who worked to contain it before it could spread to the main cell block. He was burned badly enough across one arm that the warden's report on the incident made its way into the local papers, praising the conduct of several inmates during the emergency, Caleb Reyes named specifically among them. Eleanor read his name in print at her kitchen table on an otherwise ordinary morning, alive, injured, still paying in full for a crime that had never been his, and something in her finally broke open. That was the letter she didn't tear up. That was the letter where she finally wrote, for the first time in 5 years, that she had let him carry this long enough, and that she intended to try to undo it, even if it took the rest of her life. Undoing a false confession, Eleanor discovered very quickly, was far harder than making one had ever been. Caleb had confessed freely, under no threat and no torture that any court would recognize. There was no wrongful conviction to appeal in the way the law understood appeals, only a lie so complete and so willingly, given that the legal system had no real mechanism built for questioning it. She began, in the years that followed, doing the only thing she could think to do, retracing the robbery itself from the ground up, nearly a decade after the fact. She spent years tracking down the two riders who had actually taken part in the robbery alongside her brother men who had scattered in the chaos afterward, one toward Nebraska, the other into the Dakota Territory, neither of them eager to be found by anyone asking questions about a robbery a decade old. One of the two men had died of fever some years before Eleanor ever found his trail, taking whatever he knew to an unmarked grave. The other, a man named Silas Whitlock, had done something Eleanor never expected. He had reformed. He'd married, taken up farming under a different surname, and built a quiet, respectable life he had absolutely no intention of burning down for a stranger's sake. Eleanor found him in 1875, 7 years after the trial. Her first visit to his farm ended with the door shut in her face before she'd finished a sentence. Her second visit, months later, ended with Silas telling her plainly that she was asking him to hang himself so that a stranger could go free, and that he had a wife and children inside who knew nothing of who he used to be. It took a third visit, nearly 2 years after the first, and a promise Eleanor herself helped negotiate with a sympathetic circuit judge, a narrow grant of immunity, offered in exchange for a truthful sworn statement before Silas Whitlock finally agreed to speak. His statement, given quietly and only once, confirmed everything Eleanor had spent nearly a decade trying to prove, that he and the second, now deceased rider had carried out the robbery at the Millbrook Trust, and that Thomas Hale, not Caleb Reyes, had been the third man that night. Caleb Reyes had not been within 100 miles of the trust when it was robbed. By 1877, 9 years after the original trial, Eleanor Hale had assembled a case that no honest judge could easily dismiss. A sworn confession from a surviving accomplice, a set of inconsistencies in the original arrest record that she had spent years quietly documenting, and a formal petition for clemency addressed to the governor's office itself. She mailed that petition not knowing whether it would ever be read, let alone acted upon. She had by then spent nearly a third of her life on this single act of repayment. The governor's pardon came through in the fall of 1,878 10 years, almost to the month after Caleb Reyes had first walked into that Millbrook courtroom and confessed to a crime that was never his. By the time the paperwork finally caught up to the truth, Caleb had already served his full sentence. The pardon did not shorten his time. It only, finally, cleared his name. Eleanor Hale was there on the day he walked out through the penitentiary gates, 27 years old now. No longer the frightened 17-year-old who had watched from a courtroom gallery and said nothing. She had traveled 2 days by wagon and rail to be standing at those gates when they opened. Caleb stepped out into the autumn light, older than the man who'd gone in, marked by a decade of hard labor, a burn scar still visible along one forearm from the fire that had, in its own strange way, set this entire chain of events into motion. He saw her waiting, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. When he finally spoke, it was to tell her she shouldn't have come all this way. She told him she had come a great deal farther than this to get him to this particular gate. She told him everything, then, standing in the road outside the prison walls, the 11 letters she'd torn up before she found the courage to send one. The newspaper clipping about the fire that had finally broken 10 years of silence. The years spent chasing down Silas Whitlock across 2 territories, and the promise she'd had to broker just to get him to speak. The decade she had spent trying, in whatever way she could, to repay a debt her family owed a stranger who had never once asked to be repaid. Caleb told her, quietly, that he hadn't done any of it expecting repayment. She told him that was exactly why she'd had to do it anyway. Caleb Reyes and Eleanor Hale were married the following spring, in the same county where he had once been sentenced to 10 years for a crime he never committed. Thomas Hale returned for the wedding the first time the two men had stood in the same room since that night in the barn a decade earlier, when one man's confession had changed the course of both their lives. Caleb rarely spoke publicly, in the years that followed, about the decade he'd spent inside the Kansas State Penitentiary. When he was asked why he had done it, why a stranger with nothing to gain would give up 10 years of his own life for a family he barely knew, his answer never changed from the one he'd given Thomas in that barn before sunrise. That a man who had pulled someone from a river once did not get to stand by and do nothing the second time, whatever form the river took. Some debts, it turns out, are paid in a single act of courage, in the space of a single night. Others take 10 years, 2 territories, 3 visits to a stranger's door, and the quiet, stubborn refusal of one woman to let a good man be forgotten by the world that had wronged him.